This is the Total Perspective Vortex. I'm Tragula.
And I'm Christian.
It's July 10th, 2020. It's another Friday, Christian.
You know what day it is?
Yes.
Do you know what day it is? It's Mailbag Day!
I prefer Friday listener questions, FLQ.
Yeah.
Taking it back.
FLQ, yeah. Okay, all right. FLQ Day! I don't know.
That's maybe too soon for that.
Yeah.
That's Canadians. Too soon for that one.
Too soon for that. I don't know what how people are going to rate that. You know, like we're saying we're using these terms. FLQ Day might not, bring us high in the YouTube algorithms. Yeah. But anyway.
Or conversely, it may elevate us, depending on...
Yeah, that's right. Those damn commies. So we have an actual listener question today, which we seem to be getting more and more of, which is great. Did you want me to just dive into it? It seemed to me like much of what you describe as origins, i.e. stories, exemplars, etc., could be applied to any sort of ideology or sets of ideals. At what point do you think ideology becomes a religion, specifically, and not, say, a broader philosophy, a national myth, or political ideology?
All right. So that's a really good question.
Yeah.
From a loyal listener. And maybe to boil it down, I hope I'm going to hit all his points. But to boil it down, it's really like, what is the difference between ideology and religion? Right. So I would say that there are interrelated concepts. So there's definitely some overlap between them. But the first difference I'm going to draw is that there is a significant difference in focus. So religions tell us how to live, their plan of how to live, whereas ideologies focus more on being a system to understand the world. There is overlap there, but one is focused on, like an ideology is more focused on describing the world, where religion is more focused on what you do, if that makes sense. And of course, with a religion...
So prescriptive versus descriptive, potentially?
No, because prescriptive versus descriptive is like how the world should be, ought to be. And there's more of that in religion.
Okay.
But religion is more like a plan, and a ideology is more of a description.
Okay, so let's hear you flesh those out.
Okay, yeah. So an ideology will tell you how the world is. A political system or a scientific theory is more along the lines of an ideology. And I'm not saying science is necessarily ideology. That's not a can of worms. But I'm saying it's describing the world. So communism, for example, describes economic relationships. And it says things like labor equals value.
Right, the labor theory of value. Yeah.
Yeah, the labor theory of value. So that's a description of how the world is. That's not focusing on how you act. Right, so religion's more about value judgments, but value judgments are more about what one should do. Saying something is good or bad is really at the core. It's like saying like what beliefs you should have and how you should act. So it's more about religion is bringing it back. Religion is more about how to live your life. Now if you may be getting caught up because it's not a clear delineation. It's a difference of focus. You can't tease these things apart entirely, because any plan or any religious doctrine that's telling you how to live your life is necessarily going to imply some ideology. It's going to make some statements about how the world is. And conversely, something like an ideology like communism, which has like a labor theory of value, it's focusing on how the world is, but that's still going to have implications about how you should live.
Which would explain kind of like cultural Marxism, right? Because when you believe these things, it leads you to certain behaviors. Is that what you're?
Yeah, yeah. Well, like, and that's why people get confused. It's like why ideologies began to seem like religions, and religions seem ideological.
Okay.
Okay.
I prefer black and white thinking. I don't appreciate this Venn diagram.
So there's overlap there. Like, so it's definitely some muddiness to the concepts. But I'm going to actually delineate some things that actually now flesh out more of how you can tell an ideology from a religion. Well, I actually just finished my From Stories to Religion TPV in 5 minutes. It's up now. And I really sort of get into how religion is developed from stories and meaning. And the end of religion there, I talk about when we get to God, one way of describing God is an iterative loop, a horn of plenty. God is the things that you abstract out of a pantheon of gods, or out of all the virtues, is a process or a practice that happens to be an iterative loop. But it's a generative loop. It generates good, it generates plenty. And this is like the idea of a horn of plenty, I think derives from this. The cornucopia that they use as a symbol in Thanksgiving, it's originally from Greek mythology. It's this horn that keeps on spiraling. And if you think of how the horn, the cornucopia, is shaped, and the tradition of that kind of horn, like of an animal, it starts at a small point and it grows bigger, bigger, and bigger, and out of it explodes all this goodness, right? Right? Okay. So there's that iterative process. Now, an ideology, and this is the similarity, is built up in a similar fashion to the way a religion is. But the loop at the end isn't a horn of plenty, it's an infinite loop. It's rigid and perfect and circular. If that makes sense. So it's not generative. Or it may be useful at the time, but because it's an infinite loop, it will become discordant with reality. And there's no mechanism for it to... An ideology lacks the mechanism to bring it back into accord with reality as the future changes, as the environment changes, and that discordance with reality, disharmony with reality, will increase. So ideologies tend to fossilize and be left in the dust because they don't grow. So one of the things that, like, a good test of whether something is an ideology, like a perfect ideology that has a propensity, they'll have a propensity to fossilize. Like, if you have an infinity loop at the core of your ideology, is to see what happens at the points of discordance with reality. So if you're in a trapped ideology, the reality, when there's a conflict between reality and the ideology, the reality will be judged wrong.
Right. So what immediately comes to mind is, with communism, where it's like, it's not working, therefore, have we tried genocide? Have we tried mass murdering people? That didn't work. Okay, all right. Do we try mass murdering the right people? Let's try to identify and then mass murder.
Well, I mean, we don't have to go straight to mass murder, but you can start with...
I'm just giving a
historical
example.
Okay,
but we've seen not all ideologies.
But
are
another example from communism that you can give is the communism was supposed to be this hugely the factories production was supposed to explode, but factory production went down. So the rationalization was that there must be spies in all the factories who are purposely sabotaging production. They were called wreckers. So the only reason, like with the Glorious Revolution, is not working is because our country is plagued with wreckers. Right. So an explanation has to come in for that, and that's what you'll see in ideologies is this the discordance with reality. There is no mechanism for the ideology to maintain, or to maintain its harmony, its concordance with reality as the environment changes.
And how would religion be different then, I guess, in that case? Like if we gave a religious example.
Well, and this is where I talk about a healthy, because you can certainly have this occurrence, this discordance with religion, and that's what I would call an unhealthy dogma. Right. Because I think that a healthy religion, like the iterative loop, has built into it that challenging process, and this is the healthy relationship between like a student and a mentor, or the hero and the father, right? That if Jordan Peterson talks about like rescuing your father from the underworld.
Yeah, rescuing your father from the belly of the whale. That's my best Peterson.
Okay. Yeah, and that's...
I'd like to apologize to everyone. Go on.
That's the mechanism of how that's the mechanism of how the dogma is brought back into concordance with the environment. Right, and so that's actually baked into the iterative loop, and that's how one of the reasons why it's a productive loop, and it stays productive, it stays healthy. So when people like challenge the church for being out of touch, that's a healthy part of the religious process. The religion has to be reinventing itself and correcting itself. The dogma needs to be able to stand up to genuine healthy challenge. And if not, a little bit of death, a little bit of reform is required. Ideologies lack that mechanism. They become a perfect loop. The dogma is always referred back to, and if the environment has changed and if reality is gotten out of concordance, then we have to defer to the dogma, and reality must be wrong. Yeah. So that's sort of the drum there. Now, one way I'm exploring these ideas is by reading Tolkien, like the Lord of the Rings. And I think that, like, I mean, I haven't talked about it too much in the podcast, but you'll see that I tie to a lot of archetypes and mythology, and I and like the whole baked into the, like my theory of morals is this idea that really good stories have lots to say about how the world is, about how we should act in the world. They have lots of lessons there. So there's actually, even though it could be fantasy, the reason it resonates is because it has this concordance with reality and how reality operates. So in The Lord of the Rings, the central villain is Sauron, and he has a ring of power, right? Which is the focal point of the story. Is Frodo's quest, along with his friends, to destroy the ring of power. Sauron's ring is the focus of the story. Now, what I think the ring represents is the ideology of power, which is ideology in its purest form.
Interesting.
Like where it's completely divorced from reality. But the ideology is totalizing and still there. So reality must bend to the will of the ideology. So, and this, I believe, is what postmodernism is. Or postmodernism is the modern closest representation of that ideology of totalizing power. And this is why it's so powerful and tempting, because it can actually, and it has this power to control and destroy.
Do you want to flesh that out a little bit?
Oh, definitely. This is where I'm going. So the ring in the Lord of the Rings, and I know that Christian, you're not too familiar with the Lord of the Rings mythos, so you're probably not the best person for me to have this conversation with, but maybe I'll be able to connect to more listeners, because I can tell you a little bit more about the Lord of the Rings while I'm doing this. So there isn't just one ring in the Lord of the Rings. There's the one ring, this Sauron's ring, which is the ring to rule them all, the ring of power. But there's lesser rings that Sauron gifted to the different races of Middle-earth. Right. So
I've played the video games.
Okay. But there's three rings for the elves.
Okay.
There's 7 rings for the dwarves and 9 rings for the humans. Right. Now, what these rings represent is other ideologies. So it's saying that all other ideologies are shadows or subservient to the one ring of power, right? Because ultimately, what is behind all the ideologies is power. Because the power is what forces that how that discordance with reality is handled, like this sort of tyranny of don't pay attention to that, maintain the ideology. And what happens is, so all the rings ultimately were sort of traps by Sauron to force people, to enslave people to the one ring. You could say postmodernism. But the reason they accepted the rings as gifts and they used them is because the rings had utility to their societies. So the rings became the center of their societies. Now all the humans, the 9 rings, they were all corrupted because they were so enthralled with power. But the dwarves and the elves represents different parts of society, or culture and classes that exist and have their own ideologies. So the 7 kingdoms of the dwarves, the dwarves are more of the entrepreneurial craftsmen, the merchants, the people who want to go out and build things, or dig, as they do, they live in mines and they find treasure, right? So they're the ones who engage with reality more and actually produce the goods. The economists, or the merchants, right? The merchants, right? The merchants.
Merchants, laborers.
The laborers.
Yeah, okay.
And their rings created huge fortunes of gold, right? Or huge fortunes of wealth that eventually attracted dragons, which destroyed the dwarves, or most of the dwarves. So all the dwarven rings were lost are lost by the end of the stories. And most of the dwarves fell to the actual wealth that was generated. But again, it's that the idea of the ideology that I'm saying is the discordance with reality increases, because it's the perfect infinite loop. The ring is the perfect infinite loop. And that's what leads to the destruction, is that there can be generative power as long as there's that concordance with reality, but over time that will break down. So the elves are the most interesting story, though, because the elves still use their rings, and they don't want to give up their rings, even by the end of the story. So there's 3 elven rings. And 2 of the elven rings are held by, one is held by Galadriel of Lothlorien, and the other is Elrond of Rivendell, which are the last 2 great sort of elven cities or civilizations in Middle-earth. And both of those beautiful scenes, or those beautiful ways of life, are maintained by the rings, are maintained by the ideology. Okay. But the elves are unique in that they're immortal. And eventually they're forced in the story to leave Middle-earth because they become so disconnected with Middle-earth. So the elves represent the artists and the intellectuals.
Okay.
And they're locked in their ideologies. but they actually, when the ideologies of the intellectuals and the artists become discordant with reality, unlike the dwarves who are destroyed by it, the elves are forced to leave along with their ideologies. So they have to bring the rings with them because they're so disconnected from reality, from Middle Earth, that they have to go off to the realm of this other imaginary realm. They have to go with their ideals. So you could sort of talk about their Platonic ideals, their ideology, away from reality. So the elves leave Middle Earth. The artists and the intellectuals choose their ideology over reality and leave.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah. So there's lots there, and so there's finally, and this is like the twist, is Gandalf has the third elven ring, and of course he's instrumental in the ultimate destruction of the Ring of Power and Frodo's quests. But you can tell that Gandalf too has his ideology that is slowly becoming discordant from the world of Middle Earth, which is like he has a heroic ideology, right? So he's bringing people on these heroic journeys of saving the world. So he's sort of a man of his times, right? So he helps save the world, but once the world is saved, his ideology is no longer.
So like a Trump figure.
I was thinking more Churchill, but.
All right.
But you can take it there, I guess. I'm sure it won't alienate too many of our listeners.
Yeah, exactly.
I really, at one point, I hope that the people who are suffering from some degree of Trump derangement system, I can bring them on board with some of these topics that we're discussing here.
Right.
But we are filthy, dirty, deplorable Trump supporters. So we shouldn't hide that.
Yes. Yeah. And it was meant to be a little punchier. There's so many more people, like you said, Churchill hundreds of historical figures that, anyway.
There were men of their times that were then put aside once their time had passed. I think that listener's question was quite the horn of plenty. So I think, and that's another episode of the Total Perspective Vortex. If you like what we're doing here, please like and subscribe. But most of all, share the podcast around. Recommend an episode that you think will resonate with someone to someone else, and because that's how we'll grow. We'll grow from people sharing the episodes.
Cheers.